I want to talk a little bit, to start off this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the participants in the mold issue. Basically, a lot of the regulation over the years have come from federal and state governments. United States EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, in April of 2001, going back quite a long time now, came out with regulations and guidelines, and keep that in mind, they're guidelines, they're not law. It's called mold remediation in school and commercial buildings. Well, you might think, or you might be wondering, well, what does that have to do with us as realtors? If I manage commercial buildings, that's great. But when it comes to mold mitigation, remediation, and potential litigation, this is what the courts and the attorneys recognize as whether or not things were done properly or not. They also recognize what's called the New York City guidelines. New York City guidelines came out before the EPA guidelines did. And that's technically what everybody followed, because there were no other guidelines in other states. So even in the state of Virginia, we followed New York City guidelines, because that's what, when we got certifications, that was what we were told to do. So that's kind of where that came from. The other thing is kind of interesting, is the state of Virginia recognized that we do have a mold problem in some structures here, especially after an event like a hurricane or a northeaster goes through. We have situations where we have more mold claims fester from water and crawl spaces and so on and so forth. So in June of 2011, the state adopted a mold certification, 3-day certification law that went into effect. And because of budget cuts in June of 2012, that bill was killed. So there is no Virginia law now when it comes to mold certification for professionals. Now there is mold law or rules that have to be followed by realtors, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, because you do have something other, the Landlord-Tenant Act, I believe. I don't really talk about that too much because that's not my forte. I'm not the professional in that. I know you know a lot more of that than I do, but there is something in the Landlord-Tenant Act there where you've got to do certain things for a tenant if they say there's mold in the building, or have certain disclosures. So that's something to consult with your attorney about to make sure you're within those guidelines. Other participants in the mold issue, obviously insurance companies, coverage issues, exclusions and preventions. Most insurance companies will not cover mold in the structure unless it's directly related to a water damage. And because they get us on claims so quickly these days, we have what's called that 148 rule, where when they call us, we have to call the customer back in a minute, we have to be on site within 4 hours, and we have to have a preliminary estimate within 8 hours. Well, how can mold grow that quickly if we're there that fast? It's not going to. So if mold grows, the insurance company is typically going to deny that claim if we were out there that quickly. The mold was probably from a previous event or something else, maybe a maintenance issue or something. So just important for you to know. Now what you can do, this is important to know, that you can have riders on insurance policies. You can go to your agent and say, look, I want to be covered from mold in case it ever happened. Especially with all the crawl spaces we have geographically in the Hampton Roads area, it might be a good idea to have something like that. I would get it if you can. Other participants, restoration professionals. When mold became a big issue back in 2003, 2004, and there was a lot of litigation, we had to be careful in what we were doing. We had to get we needed more education. We needed to be more qualified. So there's a lot of industry certification that we have to go through every year. And we have to have what's called pollution insurance. This is important. If you work with someone that's going to do mold in a structure that you're either trying to sell, or let's say you manage a property and you hire a handyman, make sure they have pollution insurance. If they don't, you're the one that hired them. You're the one that's going to hear from the attorney if things go awry. But there's no such thing as called mold insurance. What it falls under, the peril that it falls under, which is a term that the insurance industry uses, is pollution insurance. It's rather costly, $3,000 to $5,000 a year in addition to your limited liability. Pollution insurance is not covered under your limited liability. So if a contractor was doing a job at a structure that you lease or manager are going to sell, whatever, as long as they have that pollution insurance, you're covered. If they don't, if something goes wrong, you may not be covered. Just something you may want to know. Other participants, realtors and property managers, obviously. Listing and selling agents' disclosures. There's a lot of things that you got to put in the disclosures now to make sure that you're compliant in selling the home or leasing the home. There's that infamous Landlord-Tenant Act that has certain provisions in it. I think that might be coming up on the next slide, actually. Building owners and occupants. There was not remediating problems years ago. But due to litigation issues, more managers and owners have become a lot more proactive with that. Some participants, once again, with the EPA, this is kind of what they set up. And this is important for you to know, because if it's a small area, like 10 square feet, you know, it's kind of like business as usual. Just clean it up. You know, if you got water behind cabinets and you pull the cabinets out and you see some mold because the water was sitting there for a while, if it's less than 10 square feet, you can probably clean it up. If it's 10 to 100 square feet, the rules basically say you can cover it up with plastic, but be careful when you take it off because you don't want to be dispersing mold into the air. We're going to talk about that a little bit briefly through this presentation, microtoxins and how they can be released in the air. But the important key here that you need to be concerned about is the 100 square foot rule. The EPA says that anything over 100 square foot, you must hire a professional to come in and possibly hire an industrial hygienist to come in. We have plenty of industrial hygienists that we can refer to as some local folks that do this kind of work. They may charge you know, a little bit of money to come in and do testing, and I'll explain to you in this presentation some of the testing that they do, but what it does is it protects you from any litigation, and you're doing things right to protect that tenant.